I want to thank you all for coming out in the wonderful world of Zoom. Um, I'm Phil Pine. I am the founder and director of a group called Capital Educators. The main thing I do is I try to help 11th and 12th graders prepare to sit for the official SAT and ACT. I also give a number of these mock exams all over the area. I've been doing tests at BCC for 15 plus years. This was the first one we've administered virtually, and I'm so glad so many students were able to participate. I do want to let you know a couple of things that you probably know. The first is if you haven't received your scores already, they're coming. We literally drop them in the mail on Monday morning. So if for any reason they don't arrive by the beginning of next week, feel free to reach out and nudge me, and I'll be happy to find another way to get you those scores. If you haven't received your score report yet, that will not interfere with our presentation tonight in the slightest. You will be able to follow along perfectly, and you'll be able to make sense of the score report when it does finally get to your door. So, interesting. By about a 2-to-1 ratio, you all said this is a true statement that standardized testing is less important now than it might have been in the past. I think there's something to that. Let's take a second and let's talk about where standardized testing is right now. And maybe the most useful way to address this is to try to put yourselves in the shoes of the current senior class, the kids in the high school year of 2021 who have either just sent off their college applications or who are scrambling to finish them before the Christmas break. Okay. These students, as you probably know, are facing a college admissions landscape that is almost purely test optional, which means these students have been able to apply basically anywhere they'd like without submitting an SAT score or an ACT score. And that's certainly a unique moment in time, okay? Now, if you ask most of us in counseling and testing, we don't expect the landscape to remain static forever. And so for so many of you who are in 10th grade or are the parents of 10th graders, there is certainly a solid chance that a number of schools that are currently test optional will flip back to requiring testing. It's a fairly safe bet. But let's go the other way for a second. Let's assume that supposition is wrong and that 8 months from now, even 20 months from now, you're facing the exact same parameters in college admissions. I would argue that even under these circumstances, testing should play a role, will play a role, and is something that you should plan for and potentially prepare for, okay? And I'll try to explain why by starting with some nomenclature. If you look on the far left, you'll see that I've got a designation of schools that are test blind. At last count, there are about 32 institutions across the country that fall into this category that are either test blind or test free, depending on whom you talk to. What that means is not only do they not require scores, but if you send scores, they won't even look at them. Okay, that's a unique spot. You've got about 3 dozen schools in the entire country that fall into that place. Pretty much everyone else falls into this wide band of test optional, with the exception at the moment of the service academies, which tend to be the only places that are requiring scores of every single applicant that they receive. Now, okay, again, test optional does not mean test blind. Okay, as one college admissions officer put it to me recently, okay, you can apply here without an SAT score or an ACT score and you won't be disadvantaged. But if you have a strong result on either of those tests, it certainly wouldn't hurt you to share that result. And so that's the delicate sentence that we're all navigating. And the fact of the matter is, even though 90+% of colleges you'll care about are test optional, they've embraced this policy with different degrees of enthusiasm. So about 1,100 institutions are permanently test optional. And to be clear, most of them were not requiring testing well before the arrival of the coronavirus. This has been a movement ongoing for the last 10 to 15 years. On the other extreme, if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that some of the larger state schools out there are test optional this year, but they certainly would prefer to have testing scores because it provides such a useful data point in admissions. Everyone else is in the middle. They are experimenting with this policy. They are trying to figure out how successfully they can put together a freshman class with far fewer standardized testing scores. And based on their degree of success, that's going to impact how quickly they potentially revert back to requiring testing. A little bit more about test optional before we get into your reports. So one reason we suspect a lot of schools will stay optional is that even though it complicates admissions for them, they actually benefit in some pretty direct ways almost instantaneously. The truth is, the first thing a college experiences when it goes test optional is the number of applications it receives shoots way up. And that's because more kids feel more emboldened to apply to more places, ones that might have felt statistically and numerically out of reach otherwise. Okay. Another thing colleges see that they don't talk about so much is that going test optional in kind of a counterintuitive way improves their test scores. Because if you think about it, the students who opt to send their numbers are the ones who are pleased with how they did. And so from a college's vantage point, they're getting more applications. They can report higher scores for their incoming freshmen. And they're doing all this while engaging in the enviable goal of actually improving access to people from all over the country. Students from less affluent areas, underserved areas, and weaker high schools in particular. So for this reason, you should expect the expression test optional to linger well through the time you all are applying to college. If this was too abstract and philosophical for you, I'll bring it home a little more directly. How does it benefit you and your kids? Okay. Well, for starters, I kind of intimated this already. Students are going to have a wider path to competitive colleges in a test optional world. That doesn't mean all of your kids can apply to Harvard without SATs and expect to get in. But there will be a number of ways in which admission may be a touch easier given the fact that you have control over your scores. Speaking of control, maybe the more important way that test optional helps students is the fact that it puts that power in your hands. For starters, you can completely ignore the advice I'm kind of gently disseminating tonight. You can opt not to take these tests, period. But more usefully, what students can do now is they can take the official SAT or the official ACT. They can collect their scores. And in the fall of senior year, they can decide with the help of people like us whether to send those scores off. To give you some idea, there will be some of your kids who do so nicely on these tests that they are going to end up sending their standardized test scores everywhere to literally every college on their list because it'll be an important data point that enhances their chance of admission. There will be some kids in the exact opposite boat who, despite whatever efforts they make, are unable to get their scores up to the level of their transcript and their grades. And they may go the other way and say, you know what, I'm not going to send my scores anywhere. And what gets a little more strategic and complicated is that many students will actually end up sending scores to some institutions, but not to others. Okay. They'll shield them from colleges with very, very high average scores, and they'll send them to colleges where the numbers will be of benefit. So bottom line is this: there is literally nothing to lose from taking these tests. We still feel that almost every junior should be lining up to sit for SATs and ACTs and then making educated decisions after the fact about whether and where to send those numbers. All right, Neha, I just talked at these guys for a good chunk of time. Are there any questions I can address at this point?
They're quiet. I think you're doing a good job.
Yeah, I'll take your quiet to be approval, but please do not be shy about asking as we go. I have one more slide here that really addresses this whole test optional universe. Um, it's a slide that Neha put together for me. And full disclosure, Neha is a graduate of College Park, and so she had her own reasons for going here. But if we take a look at applicants at College Park, a couple points here. Pre-coronavirus, anyway, the average score for students on the College Park campus undergrad was right around 1380, pretty high. And the average ACT equivalent out of 36 points was 31. Okay. So we're going to take a look at a couple of kids and their decision-making process as they apply to the University of Maryland. So here's our first. All right. Our first student scores a 1440 on the official SAT. For this student, the decision-making process is pretty darn straightforward. Almost independent of what his transcript looks like, almost irrespective of his grades, this student is going to send his scores because they are at the upper edge of what Maryland is expecting of its undergraduates. It's almost at the 75th percentile, as a matter of fact. And so the school would appreciate receiving those scores, and the student's admissions chances should be bolstered by sending them. Okay, we've got a second student. Very similar looking, but with slightly lower scores. This student has a 1230, okay? Now, before you all engage in Montgomery County hyper-competitiveness, okay, you should know a 1230 nationally puts a student at about the 80th percentile, okay, across the entire country. So it's a very good score. But if this applicant is serious about attending Maryland, he would probably decide to withhold these scores from College Park because they fall below the 25th percentile. Our third student comes in at 1350, okay? Just under the midline, right below the 50th percentile. In this case, there is a decision to be made, and you might get different advice depending on whom you address. But in our experience, a student with scores like this will usually send those results because even if they aren't quite at the midline, they are awfully close. For a lot of students, the litmus test is if your scores fall within the middle 50% band, you're going to seriously think about sending those numbers off to the college that you're interested in.
How would you define a good SAT score?
Sure. So I can give you a couple of scores that might help you. Let's start with an average score nationally. A college-bound senior with a score of about 1050 would fall right at the 50th percentile nationally. That's a purely average score, heart of the bell curve. Okay. When you jump up from there, you start to jump your percentiles pretty quickly. So as I mentioned, a 1230 puts you somewhere between the 75th and 80th percentile. Okay. A 1440 is going to put you north of the 95th percentile. For a lot of people, the reason test prep ends up making a lot of sense is that 100 to 200 point score improvements, which are typically pretty doable with quality prep, can jump your percentiles as much as 20 to 30%. And that can make the difference in the admissions process. All right. Again, Neha, jump in when it's time. I'm going to shift the conversation a bit. So if the first question Neha and I tend to get asked is, how important is standardized testing? The next band of questions have to do with SATs versus ACTs. So I think we have one more poll here for you to quickly participate in. Let me see where you come down on this. All right, this is an interesting one. So we've got basically a 50-50 split here. 53% of you say this is a true statement. 47% of you say false. And in this case, I am with the minority. Okay. Before I ran with the majority, you guys were right. But in this case, this statement is no longer true. And I understand why there was a split, because for years, there was some bias out there at colleges. East and West Coast schools expected and prioritized SATs over ACTs. Midwestern schools were much more used to getting ACTs from their applicants. Nowadays, that is completely done with. And so what a lot of people try to figure out at this time between the fall of 10th grade and the fall of 11th is, which test should I take? And we will present it here as a multiple choice question to make Neha and me comfortable. I've tried to gently eliminate choice C from your thought process, okay? We're really looking at taking the SAT, the ACT, or both. Now, one reason we think it's an enviable goal to figure out which test is the better fit is really played out in the practice testing. Every fall that I can remember, we have given practice SATs and practice ACTs at BCC. And the purpose of that is to help you compare the scores and help you compare the experiences. And as a student, maybe walk away with a strong feel for which test is a better fit for your personality and your temperament. It's nice to pick your poison, but I want to be really clear about something. Picking your test should not cause any great stress, whether you're a sophomore or a junior. And that's because these tests are really remarkably similar nowadays. Like if I had to throw a number at it, I would say the SAT and the ACT are about 80% identical and maybe 20% different. And that was not always the case. Given that 80% overlap, here's what Neha and I find pretty regularly. If you decide that you think the SAT is your preferred exam and you start preparing for it in one way or another, studying on your own, working with a tutor, taking a class like the ones that we run at CapEd, okay, I can promise that good quality work for this test will carry over beautifully onto the ACT. And similarly, if you target the ACT, all the content and technique that you develop will carry over beautifully onto the SAT. To give you some feel for this, okay, I started Capital Educators in 1997, so we're pushing 25 years, okay? For most of that time, I always ran separate ACT and SAT classes because the discrepancies between the tests were numerous and meaningful. But in their current iterations, these tests are so similar that we now run one course, and at the end of that course, many students will decide to take one test, the other, or both. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of the kids we see who work at this for 2 to 2.5 months, who really get engaged in their test prep, will often decide to take both tests, not because they're gluttons for punishment, but connecting back to the whole test optional thing. If you take both exams and your SAT is much better than your ACT, you're going to send that SAT everywhere. If the reverse is true, you'll send that ACT everywhere. And if you are happy with how you did on both, you can very happily and very nerdily send your scores to every college you're looking at. No institution is expecting both. It's not something that needs to be an objective of yours, but there's little to lose from taking both exams, except for that registration fee and obviously the agita of taking an extra test on one more Saturday morning.
What approximate score should a student have gotten on the practice test?
Okay. All right. I can't really answer that directly. There's no score someone should or should not get. Obviously, different people have different strengths and are going to score very differently on the exams. But I will say this, which might be most useful. I can pretty much promise the scores your kids earned on these practice tests were very accurate snapshots of what they get on the official exams. But almost all of the students out there should end up doing significantly better on these by the time they take the real thing. Sophomores, you absolutely will. If you took this test at the beginning of 10th grade with no preparation, no real understanding of what the tests do, there is no way you will not see some growth in your score by virtue of practice and maturation and brain development. There is a huge difference between testing in December of 10th grade and October of 12th grade. You will be a different person by then. And even for juniors, you can and you should expect your scores to change dramatically. To give you a sense of this, in the courses that we run at CapEd, we see an average score improvement on the SAT, for example, of about 160 points. That's our median, actually. So half of our students in 2 months will improve by more than 160, half will improve by less than 160, and almost everyone will go up between 100 and 250 points. So we wanted you to get these starting scores. We want you to look at the reports carefully, but you should not feel married to these numbers in any way possible, okay? I will share one more local data point just to make this a little clearer for you. All right. If you are quietly, okay, discreetly, politely competitive, all right, you should just know the average scores that you'll find at a high school like BCC for college-bound seniors are going to end up being around 1,300. That is abnormally high. That is not something you're going to find at public schools across the country, but that should give you a feel for just how strong our pool is in the immediate DC area. Now, having talked about how similar these tests are, I want to just point out a couple of differences because I know a number of you not only took this test from us last weekend, but also the ACT last month. Both SATs and ACTs test content. Both are multiple choice. Neither has a guessing penalty. And both tests extend an optional essay. This essay, thankfully, has dropped off in popularity precipitously. Colleges, frankly, do not care about this writing exercise anymore, to the point that we're not even recommending that students in our courses write these optional essays. And that's one reason why we didn't subject kids to writing them in the virtual environment last weekend. When you get to differences, though, couple that stand out. The ACT has a separate dedicated science section. It's 40 questions in 35 minutes. It's the last section of the test. It's a little bit intimidating at first if you've never seen it before. And it's the portion on which most BCC students had the greatest difficulty this past month when they sat for the ACT. The SAT does not have a separate science section, but in a not so subtle way, it sprinkles about 36 scientific questions all over the test. So 2 reading stories are always about science, okay? Many math questions, about a dozen, are always testing the same scientific reasoning skills you find on the ACT. Analysis of tables and charts and graphs. Bottom line, you don't want to pick your test based on a love of science or a hatred of it, because you're going to have to do about the same amount of it on both exams. And actually, more globally, I wouldn't look at a chart like this to figure out which test you end up pursuing. The single best way to make that call is to try the tests and compare the experiences, as so many of you have already done. The only other content that sometimes people notice relates to math. The ACT tests more geometry and trig. The SAT is more algebraic in orientation, more questions involving functions, more modeling questions, more wordy algebra problems. But in the end, it's not usually about the math or science content that throws students in one direction or the other. Most students will tell you ACTs feel a tiny bit easier, a little less tricky, but they are much more difficult to finish. You have to answer many more questions per minute on the ACT to keep up with the SAT. Now, for some students, this is a no big deal. Some of your kids, and you know who they are, fly through tests. They don't need to second guess themselves. They're not interested in going back over their older work. They just plow through. Others, though, who are a little bit more deliberate, who work a little more slowly, maybe who are a little more anxious, sometimes prefer the slower pace of the SAT. But again, this is something you experience very profoundly by trying the two. To point out scores, SAT is still scored out of 1,600 points. ACT is scored out of 36 points. And I will show you a chart in a few minutes that helps you compare those numbers. I do want to make one, I don't know, Nair, are there any questions about the two exams that I should entertain? Okay. I do want to make one point about scoring. Okay. Parents, 1,600 may feel like a very familiar number to you because back in the day when we sat for the SAT, it also was scored out of 1,600 points. But one thing you should know, even though the table is ostensibly the same as it used to be, the test has changed dramatically since the 1980s, as have scores. As a matter of fact, scores have been recentered and inflated many times over. Meaning, okay, if you scored a 1,200 back in the 1980s, okay, and I'm not pointing at anyone in particular, all right, if you had a 1,200 even, let's say, that score would be roughly equivalent to about 1,350 today. There's about a 100 to 150 point gap in those scores. And I tell you this, parents, so that you can put scores in perspective. When you start to research colleges, you'll see that the numbers seem really high. Some of you may have been looking at the Maryland slide earlier and thinking, wow, 1,380, that's incredibly high. That's not what I remember. Well, our kids are smarter, they're savvier, they're prepping more, okay? But then there's also the fact that like the scores are literally inflated, all right? And I think that's a useful fact to know.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the science section on the ACT?
I can. So one thing about the science section, it's a good question to ask about. You don't need to have memorized facts from chemistry or bio or physics. You don't need to remember the mechanics formulas or pH, okay, or how to balance equations. What science is really doing is testing your ability to think scientifically. So, as I mentioned quickly, a lot of the questions involve reading dense scientific text, like reading comprehension, and answering questions about tables and charts and graphs, about scientific looking data. Because the text is dense, it can be intimidating, but in the end, the reasoning skills they're testing actually are pretty basic. And I can tell you this too, I haven't taken a science class in 35 years, and I have no problem on the science section because it's more a skill than it is science knowledge. SAT tests those same skills. It just doesn't put it all in the same place. So it's not nearly as burdensome. You don't feel it as much. Okay. Let me keep rolling here. So in a typical December, this week or the week before, students would receive PSAT score reports online that look like this, okay? Obviously, that's not the case this year, okay? And there's obviously a great chance that PSATs will not happen in late January either. I want to make a really important point about PSATs. They are much less important, parents, than you may remember them to having been, okay? PSATs are preliminary. Whether you're a 10th grader or 11th grader, the scores are never sent to colleges. They play no active role in admissions, okay? The only time they tend to matter practically is if you score in the very, very top band across the state, basically the top half of 1%, meaning you get almost a perfect score. And if you're in that boat, you are eligible for what they call national merit scholarships. Okay. But this affects a handful of people in our area every year, very few. The truth is, there's much more scholarship money wrapped up in official SATs and ACTs. So, like, if it's a choice between acing your PSAT and doing incredibly well on the official SAT, there's no decision to be made. You want the stronger SAT score. On the PSAT reports, you'll get a page that looks like this with your answers and the corrections, okay? But instead, what you're all getting this year is a score report from me that looks like this, a practice SAT report. I can promise you these scores are just as accurate as PSATs, okay? But they're formatted a little differently, so I wanna make sure I explain a few numbers so when you get your reports, you can make sense of them. Okay, top left. If you're gonna look in one place, this is probably where you'll pay attention. This is a verbal score, a math score, and your total. Notice that this student scored a 1060, which puts him at just about the national average I shared with you earlier for 12th graders, okay? The 1060 is broken down on the left-hand side here into category boxes. I'll turn to math as an example of these. If you look at the top by math, you'll find R, W, and B, which is right, wrong, and blank. So that instantly gives you a sense for where your relative strengths and weaknesses are, okay? And by the way, the percent is literally just the percentage of questions you answered correctly. It's nothing fancier than that. So if you look carefully at this student's report, he did pretty decently on the more basic topics of arithmetic and algebra, getting more right than wrong. But when you got into the more sophisticated content, the algebra 2, the geometry trig, it got uglier. And particularly in geometry, take a look at this, 0 right, 7 wrong. That to me suggests that this may be a student who never took much geometry in high school or took it so long ago that it is a distant memory. So I would look at your score. I would look at your breakdowns. At the very bottom of the page is basically a miniaturized answer sheet. This will match up with the answer sheets students should still have at home, and they shouldn't toss them. We should keep these for a while, just in case we want to review questions that way as well. But down below here, you'll see letters and pluses and dashes. A plus means you answered the question correctly. A dash means you omitted it, which they shouldn't have done because we told them many times over not to skip questions. And a letter indicates the incorrect response that they put on specific questions. So the more letters you find down here, the more mistakes you made, the lower your score will end up being. But this bar at the bottom of the report allows you to literally look over every single question on the test. And by the way, the kids all have their test booklets because they never left the home with them, okay? I emailed them. Most were printed out. They should be somewhere in your houses. If for any reason you can't find your booklet, or maybe more importantly, you have questions interpreting the score report, you should totally email Neha and me, and we can walk you through it over email or preferably over the phone. Neha, maybe we should send our email addresses out to everybody just to play it safe. Just so you guys have them in an accessible place. I will mention one other thing on the score report. Comments. The comment box is meant to highlight patterns in your mistakes. And I'll be honest, the comment section is basically for students who are taking our classes, okay? Like, because it gets a little bit technical and you get into test prep jargon. But it's meant to list all the problems that fall within an identifiable pattern we think is correctable. And this is another portion of the report that we'll be happy to go over with people individually. Here's the thing, for the juniors out there, I'm expecting that your score from me will look similar to what you scored last year on the PSAT, or hopefully a little bit better. If that's not the case, if your score is dropped, any number of things could have happened, including the reality that this test was given virtually. And while for some of your kids that puts them at ease and allowed them to test in a comfortable environment, for other students, it can be more distracting. It just can. And so before panicking, if you find an 11th grade number is lower than a 10th, I would absolutely talk to your child and I would see how they felt the virtual experience went and try to get to the bottom of it that way. But these kinds of individual questions are great reason to email Neha and me.
The subcategories aren't equally weighted. There are more questions in some than others. What does that say about where to put your effort?
I think you've actually answered your own question. That was very savvy of you. Um, yeah, you're interested in two things. How accurate are you on the different types of questions? And how many of them are there? So you can see, for example, this student has 0% correct in graphics, but there are only 3 graphical questions on the reading section. This could just be the luck of the draw. And if the student has a good day, he'll get 1 or 2 of those right. This is not a percentage you're going to worry much about. In contrast, okay, reading comprehension makes up a pretty significant proportion of the test, as does grammar. And so there are often a lot of points to be picked up, even in areas where you might be naturally stronger than others. So that's a very wise observation you made. All right. Let's say you took this test this weekend and you took the practice ACT back in November. If you are in that boat, you can use tables like these to quickly compare your scores. So I'm going to just pick a scoring point here. Let's say you earned an 1180 on my test and a 24 on your mock ACT. In that boat, you obviously scored perfectly comparably on the two, okay? You appear to be equally strong at both. You might pick your primary test based on whichever format you hated a little bit less. I just want to add to that though. If you had an 1180 and a 25, or an 1180 and a 23, those scores are also basically comparable. There's no real difference there. It's only when you look at a concordance table and find 2 or 3 or more gradations of difference that you're onto something, okay? So take these charts literally, but not super rigidly if you are going to do comparisons. But these are helpful. Parents, particularly if you don't know ACT scores as well, this is a very easy way to figure out what an average, a good, and a great ACT score might be, because it's juxtaposed with SAT numbers. Okay. Couple of quick points on timeline. First thing, notice the slide is entitled Class of 2022 Timeline. If you are a sophomore, you should not be engaging in any kind of test preparation this year. The best thing you can do long-term for your scores is engage seriously in your schoolwork. And when you have free time, do some outside reading. Those are the 2 most useful things you can do. But by the time it's junior year, that's when you're really engaging in the testing. So here we are in December. Every year, there are some students who will prep and test on the early side. Students who might do their studying in the summer and sit for the real thing in the fall. That's totally fine as long as it meshes with your extracurricular life and you can actually carve out the time for it. What most juniors do at BCC and throughout the county is they will do their prep in here. They'll study one way or another in the winter, and then they will choose an official test date that falls in second semester. The most popular combination of dates we see from the BCC kids we work with is March for the SAT, April for the ACT. And so we get a lot of students from school doing classes with us in here, January until the early part of spring. The real goal is by the end of 11th grade, you want to try to have a real score in your pocket. okay? An official banked score, so that when you start to do some serious college searching, you're doing it with actual numbers and not hypothetical ones, okay? Now, even if your spring testing goes well, just for the sake of thoroughness, a majority of students will sit for one more test into senior year, usually somewhere between July leading up to 12th grade and October of 12th grade. And at this point, even if you followed our advice and tried both tests in the spring, your last attempt is typically going to be in whichever format is a slightly better fit for you, whichever one you prefer, SAT or ACT. And so in a typical year, a typical student will sit for a total of 2 or maybe 3 official tests before they're done.
Is there a guide for basically prep options to improve a student's score?
So I don't know about a guide, but I'll try to give you some guidance. Let me just move down a couple of notches here. So broadly speaking, everyone, there are 3 general ways you can prepare for these tests. Okay. Some students are starting out high enough or are motivated enough that they can study on their own. You can find many inexpensive and even free material out on the internet and in hard copy from book distributors like Amazon. Okay. It's not difficult to find official tests to practice with. If you do that kind of self-study, you need to be self-directed. You need to carve out the hours. In my experience, it usually takes students anywhere from 2 to 4 dozen total hours to kind of hit their peak with these, 25 to 50 total hours of work. The second way to approach things is with a private tutor, and there are many good ones in the area. Private tutoring is great in terms of personal attention. You can schedule it when you want. You're going to hopefully get someone who's very knowledgeable. My only warning and concern with private tutoring is, even if you have someone who's super experienced, they're only going to work with you for about an hour a week, and then they'll see you a week later. The only way for those sessions to pay off, to really result in meaningful improvement, is if students will do 2 or 3 hours of homework in between those meetings. It's not enough to just sit with someone once a week for an hour and expect your whole test taking strategy and habit to change. For this reason, I'm biased towards small group learning. For the last 25 years, we've run courses in this manner where we group students into classes of no more than 10. We group them according to their scores and their strengths. And we do that so we can figure out what the heck we're teaching at the right pace for everybody. We have historically run these courses at schools all over the area, including in Northwest DC and in Montgomery County at places like Holton, Landon, and Holy Cross. We've been running most of our stuff online, and this is an example of what we're anticipating for the winter for our juniors. We meet with students for 2 hours on Saturdays, 2 hours on Sundays. So what they're getting is 4 structured hours, a really thorough approach, which gives us enough time to not only teach, but also practice. So a big benefit to my structure outside of the social aspect of it is there's almost no homework with this. You give us your 4 hours a weekend, we do basically everything they need together with as much guidance as people need. Our course, like any good program, will not just include instruction, it will also include practice tests, much like the one we just administered virtually through school. And our program will also offer a ton of extra help hours. So if you're looking at doing a small group program, I really think, in a very biased way, we run an outstanding course. But much like the college search is about fit, so is test prep. Some of you probably know for whom studying on your own, working with a tutor, and taking a class may be more beneficial.
What is the pricing of the course and what are our average improvements?
Sure. I'll do the second part first. The average improvement I may have mentioned briefly before. Our average improvement is right around 160 points. It's our median improvement in a period of time that looks like this. Okay. So it's a pretty significant jump in a pretty manageable amount of time. Obviously, if students are coming in a little bit lower, if students are a little more eager and earnest, they can certainly see improvements well beyond the 160. But we do expect to see virtually everyone up between 100 and 250 points. Our tuition is standard, whether it's offered online or in person. We charge $19.95, basically $2,000 for all our stuff. It's a big fee, but it includes everything: classes, practice tests, makeups, extra help hours, materials, even the chance to come back and do some work before a second SAT or ACT. And as I mentioned, another real benefit is our course will help you for either or both exams. So you don't need to know for certain what direction you want to move in at the beginning.
This jumps back to earlier in the presentation. Do you think schools who've adopted a 1-year test optional policy will extend that to at least 2022?
Yeah, so this gets into prognosticating. I hate that we're recording, aren't we, Neha? All right, I'll still make some predictions. If you're asking me, I think an overwhelming majority of schools that are test optional now will stay test optional at least for the next year. Okay. But as I've said, I still wouldn't take that to be a free pass not to test. If you can provide a strong test score, it is really going to be to your benefit. I'll be honest with you. A strong test score this year may be even more valuable than in a regular year. And that's because with extracurricular activities curtailed, with schools doing a little bit less by way of grades, colleges just have less data to use. So if you're able to send a score that's corroborative, that meshes with your record, or that is stronger than your record, you want to take advantage of it. For the sophomores out here, I know there are a lot of you, you're in more of a gray area there. I think there will be more reversion to test required. But as I'm trying to imply, this shouldn't affect your outlook on testing. You should still plan to take these exams and then make some choices after the fact.
Who teaches our classes, and what is their experience?
Sure. So you've got two of the teachers are with you here, Neha and myself. Our teachers come from different places, though. They tend to be young teachers in the area, grad students. I even use some Georgetown undergraduates. They have to have aced the exam when they took it. But more importantly, they have to have the personality that is going to connect with students. They have to be dynamic and energetic. And so one really nice thing about being a local group, I mean, I've been in DC since the 90s. We are not a national company. I hire and train literally every instructor that we have. And so not only do I make sure that they're strong, but we match teachers up with the right subject and the right level. So for example, a number of our teachers only teach higher scoring math students. Some of them only teach lower scoring verbal students. We don't just let teachers run loose and teach anyone. There's a great deal of thought that goes into matching instructors with students.
Can you talk a little bit about super scoring? Do all schools allow this? Do some not?
Okay. I snuck past that slide before. Here we go. So many of you have probably heard the expression. Super scoring just means that if you take the test more than once, the college will mix and match the numbers in such a way that it's to the student's advantage. So here's a particular kid who scored a 1240 the first time around. And maybe she was happy with how that turned out, but she wanted to get that verbal score a touch higher into the sixes. So she studies over the summer. She takes the test a second time. And as you'd expect, the verbal does improve, but the math doesn't. Now, at first blush, this looks like a useless endeavor because her overall score dropped by 10 points. But what 90+% of American institutions will do is extract the higher math score and higher verbal score and make a super score. I'll say that again. Over 90% of the colleges you'll care about, super score. And this is a big reason why people tend to test more than once. Okay. Just to complicate things, the ACT is super scored at about 2/3 of the colleges you'd look at, about 65%, but it's climbing. And I would expect it to eventually catch SAT. The ACT has 4 parts to it. So if you test a second time, you have 4 opportunities to improve. And if any one of those scores goes up, it can improve your overall number. So here's a student who tested a second time and only did better on one part, but it still results in an improvement in the super score. What I'd recommend in late junior year into fall of senior year is that you start like going on college websites and just checking to see if the schools you're interested in practice super scoring. Most want to, okay? Not only to make your kids look good, but to make them look good, because it helps their numbers get polished a little bit by reporting the super scores.
Do universities in the UK and Canada seem to prefer one test or the other?
So I mentioned it's totally democratized in the United States. That's not quite true over in Europe. In Europe, you still find that the SAT has a little more cachet. I think that's just because it's the older test and it was the East Coast test for so long. You'll also find in the UK that they just generally like testing. so even if you're looking at a test optional universe here, if you can supply a strong SAT result over there, it serves you in good stead. We'll take 1 or 2 more. And then if anyone has individual questions, I absolutely encourage you to contact us. And if you haven't received your scores, please check your mail. If it's from Capital Educators, it's not a solicitation. It's literally your result.
Are the average scores for private schools in the area higher than those of BCC?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, it's really remarkable if you think about a public school that pulls students at your scale from that wide a geographical area to have average scores as high as it does. There are some private schools, a few that will have slightly higher averages, and there are some that will be a touch lower. But you're going to have trouble finding public schools anywhere in the country that have higher numbers than we find locally. That's just a fact of life in Montgomery County.
If you only take a test once and do well, like 1400 plus, is that considered better than super scoring?
There's no difference. It's a great question. There's no difference taking the test once or taking it twice. As a matter of fact, when super scoring happens, it's typically an automated process that a human being has no part in whatsoever. But you're touching on something important, which is at what point do you stop? One thing Naya and I are pretty good at is when we work with students and they take 3 or 4 or 5 practice tests, we usually know exactly what to expect on the real day. So we can typically make a good call as to when it's time to call it quits. I really don't recommend people test 3, 4, 5 times, particularly if you're looking for very, very small improvement. As a general rule of thumb, you only want to take an SAT an extra time if you think you've left 50 to 100 points on the table. If you think there's a real jump you can still make.
If a junior can't fit your winter course into their schedule, what are the options for summer prep before their senior year? Do we have any?
We do. I mean, I'm flashing a spring course here, but if the spring is also difficult, we will be running both virtual and in-person programs in the summer. I think I can say that pretty confidently, that many students will take advantage of because they can do their prep completely independent of the school year. At the absolute earliest, that's when a rising junior might prep this summer. And frankly, at the latest, that's when a rising senior should prep. I would not put test prep off until fall of 12th grade. At that point, you really have too much going on between your classes and college applications and just general senior year pressure.
When should we sign up for our courses? Are there still spots for the winter? And how can we get a schedule to see if we can make it work?
Yeah, so I'm flashing the sample winter schedule here. Neha, maybe you can put a link to our schedules in the chat just to make that easy. I don't expect the winter classes to be full before Christmas. So if you're able in the next week to 10 days to give us a call directly, we really prefer to talk to you before you make the time commitment here. Give us a ring and we'll be happy to look at the schedule with you, talk through the possibilities, and make sure that there's a good match. Let me take one more question, then I promise I'll liberate you because I see we're at 8:30.
How far in advance do you need to register for both tests? Do they fill up?
Great question. It's usually smart to register for these exams 2 to 3 to maybe 4 months in advance. So if you're a junior and you're looking at that popular testing time of March, April, I think it's probably a wise idea to get online at College Board for SAT, at ACT for ACT, and sign up for these tests. Particularly nowadays where there's a little more anxiety about getting a seat with COVID restrictions and test accessibility, I would probably sign up to take a test at an MCPS school. I'd do that sometime between now and no later than the middle of January. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. The questions were slow to come, but then they picked up quite a bit there at the end. I hope mostly that this makes you feel better and more comfortable about testing. In the grand scheme of things, it is still much less important than your grades and your academic transcript. But it is a piece of the puzzle that we do want you to consider and consider thoughtfully. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy holidays to everyone. And please reach out if we can provide support in any way.